the obvious, is the sheer size of our diocese and the implications of that size. And geographically, I've heard Bishop Don mention many times that we are probably the largest diocese anywhere. And so the travel issues, communication issues, it's a constant extra burden that most people would not have to deal with. And so it's come up on numerous occasions. So that's why we wanted to bring it up today for a couple of reasons. Several things have happened in the discussions over the last little while. We've talked about our mission as an example, being a biblically, or building biblically faithful, gospel-sharing Anglican churches, and we're all pretty solid on that. And sort of the issue is how we sort of move to that. How we know we're being successful with that. If we were doing some comparisons of this discussion in a private company, private companies deal with various kinds of elements, and not that we wish to compare in a lot of ways with private companies because we're very much different. But basically, private companies need to know a lot about their product and that they have the right product and they focus on the right market. And it's very clear that we know what our product is, and that's been touched on in all the discussions over the last little while. We also know who our market is, and we're very clear on that. In terms of how we go about developing the infrastructure to really do it, there's never an exact right way to do it. And what we need to do, and it's never established and that's it forever. It's constantly changing and we have to deal with that. The issue of two dioceses is beginning to come to a head because, as Bishop Don mentioned earlier, is because of his charge last year. And in the charge, he introduced the issue of the sheer size of our diocese. And he made it very clear that there's been talk going on about the two dioceses, but it's hard to get a handle on. And that's why he suggested we, in fact, have these regional assemblies, just to get a flavor of what it might be like to meet in smaller groups, which is kind of interesting because this group is not really a lot smaller than the Senate meetings we've had in the last little while in terms of total registrants, so it's kind of interesting in that way. But the idea is how do you feel about that? And I'll just to bring you back a little bit, I'm just going to read the quote that sort of encouraged us to have this discussion today. And before I do that, I'll say that the reason we're having the discussion today because we want to acknowledge the fact that the reason we're having regional assemblies is to begin getting it in our minds that maybe the structure we have isn't the most effective structure for us to go forward. And so what we wanted to do is just throw it out on the table, and even though we're only just starting in this regional assembly, are you in a position to provide some input at this time? And Bishop Don's quote back then was, the main reason for this step, referring to his recommendation, to give the members of Synod a feeling of what it would be like to have a separate diocese for their area, and to discern from the experience the strengths and weaknesses of such restructuring that will take out the area of speculation, because we have been speculating, is it good, is it bad, how are we going to deal with it, and enable each member to make a better, more well-informed decision. Then later down the road, it would appear obvious what a decision should be. So we're in a position now that there's no recommendation at all on this, but it's about to become, I think, a discussion higher on the priority. And what I'm going to do is just give you just a little bit of background in terms, and then we'll lead into inviting you to comment to give you an idea of where we see it might go a bit later. So to put it in perspective, ANiC is currently one of 25 dioceses within ACNA. We have about 4,500 ASA, average Sunday attendance, in our parishes across the diocese. And ACNA has about 100,000. So ACNA has 25 dioceses approximately, these numbers are rough, and just over 100 that attend services. So we're pretty small in the big scheme of things in terms of how that works. We have, within our diocese, we have 72 congregations. If you go to our website, now that includes parish plants and projects, while ACNA has over 1,000 parishes of various sizes. Of the 72 parishes we have, there's only 25 parishes. Again, these is approximately, there's only about 25 parishes that have 50 or more people in those parishes. So even though 72 sounds like a pretty big number, and it's a huge number compared to where we were a couple of years ago, there's only 25 approximately that have 50 or more. And approximately 15 of those parishes have less than 25 members. So, we're small in that regard. However, on the other hand, we're spread pretty well across the country with our 70-odd parishes, and we're happy about that. There's still a couple of areas, such as Prince Edward Island in Saskatchewan, that we don't have parishes established yet, so we're hoping that will happen. But you can see, if you look at Ontario and BC, we have well over two-thirds of our parishes are within those two provinces. So we're spread pretty thinly in one regard, but it's clear where the major parishes are placed. We're going to have this discussion, and then we're going to decide what we think is best for us. But ultimately, ACNA really has the final say in terms of, do they accept the application as a diocese or not. And so to do that, they have specific guidelines. And they suggest that an applicant must be composed of a minimum of 12 congregations with at least 50 average Sunday attendance and a minimum of 1,000 members. So, and actually a person or a diocese could make an application even if they didn't fit that exactly the way it is. There's a diocese in formation, which takes us into another category. If you go back to, which I don't want to do, I've got to watch how I point my hand at Brian. I don't want to go back to, but the fact is, if we looked at that in terms of meeting that criteria, we clearly have the numbers on the surface to be two dioceses instead of one. So I won't mention the third diocese, and we can respond to that if there's questions in that regard. So the key question, in terms of the whole deliberation is, will two dioceses better serve ANiC? And will two dioceses better serve the parishes? Will we be more effective in achieving the objective and the mission that we have for ANiC? And if the answer to that question is yes, then we get into this whole issue of, okay, so what should it look like? Because there's a lot of different ways to structure it. It doesn't mean we automatically duplicate what we have. In fact, the ANiC Council has discussed this formally at one of their meetings back last June, and there was some information provided to them, some of it which I'm sharing with you now. And it talked about a couple of structures, i.e. the obvious one is you would simply have two. Like ANiC right now, as most of your parishes are, is an incorporated body. And so we could simply have two incorporated bodies, and they would have their own constitutions and bylaws and so on, and that's kind of how it would work. The suggestion actually, or one of the suggestions that was discussed back then, that's not in the best interest of ANiC. That was somebody's view. I'm not going to say anything negative based on Don's comments earlier about two dioceses, but the suggestion was you can just have two separate bodies. They would not be incorporated. They would remain under the one incorporated body that we have. There would be probably one board. There would be one budget, and just sort of easier to kind of manage in that regard. But you'd have two separate bodies, two separate dioceses functioning independently. So, what exactly it would look like in terms of form is yet to be determined. And I think there's probably a lot of potential, or a lot of alternatives that could be considered, at that time. In terms of the advantages that might be considered, and what I'm trying to do right now is just give you sort of a quick overview. We get an idea how we fit into the big picture and what's been suggested as advantages or disadvantages of even doing this. And these are some of the more obvious ones that have been brought forward. The first item on the advantage side has been suggested that simply the opportunity for stronger local ministry. And the idea being that there's more synergy potentially possible when you have a smaller group, closer proximity, more opportunity simply just to work together. And so that it was suggested that that could happen easier. The distance, of course, is the obvious one, particularly, as was mentioned earlier, the demands on the bishops is significant in terms of wanting to keep in touch at the level they really want to keep in touch to provide the support they want to do. That with 2 dioceses, it would be easier to do that. In terms of the sheer number of people that could participate, and I sort of alluded to a minute ago, the last several years we've averaged about 200, 215 or so people register for synod. And so when we were planning this regional assembly and the one out west, we just cut it in half and assumed we're going to have 100 each way. And that's one of the recommendations as an advantage. If you have smaller groups, you're going to have a lot more people. But we have approximately 170 people registered for this regional assembly. And we have approximately 170 that have registered for the Western Assembly that's taking place right now. Which is kind of interesting because we had, last year in Ottawa, we had roughly 215, 220. So clearly, there's a lot more people participating this week in ANiC activities than would be if it was a normal synod. The next point regarding easier access for additional dioceses to join, and the idea is that there are still dioceses and parishes, certainly within the Anglican Church of Canada, that we know are still considering some kind of a change for them. And how would we handle it if suddenly a whole diocese contacted us and said they would want to become part of ANiC? Are we set up to deal with that? And the fact is, if we've got that knock on the door, we'll figure it out pretty quickly, I'll tell you, in case anyone has any information on that, we can deal with it. But obviously, if we were already 2 dioceses, and we had the structure in place, and we had gone through that process, it just makes it easier, more inviting, and people who would be considering it would understand that. Because I know you've gone through it, and most of us have gone through this, that when you're getting ready and making a decision to join ANiC, how does it exactly work? How's it going to impact you, and your local parish council and how you function and so on? And so that's sort of one of the issues. The representation at ACNA, we're represented as one diocese. If suddenly we were 2 dioceses, we'd have double the number of representation at ACNA. And that may be a very good thing because we can influence the bigger picture. Costs twice as much to send people to the provincial assemblies, but that's an issue, and in some cases it's been suggested that it would be very beneficial to us to have more representation in that regard. The other area mentioned is just the issue of if we're 2 dioceses and eventually 3 dioceses or whatever, because I'm sure what would happen is if we became 2, we would then have a template in place to really evolve as growth warrant that sort of move. And I know there are many people who have the dream and the vision that someday Canada will be a province. And therefore, we can't be a province with 1 diocese. And so if that's our long-term goal, and if we're going to begin that kind of process, doesn't it make sense to have more than 1 diocese now, knowing that long-term, that's really what one of our goals really is. So we should be thinking a little bit more about that. The last item is relative I was confused on this one a little bit, so I'll tell you how I'm reading this. But it's really talking about how people now currently relate to ANiC. And do they relate to, to ANiC? See, we're already part of ANiC, so I don't want to push this. But if we were smaller, in our diocese, would the individual parishes in those dioceses relate better to the bishop because simply of the exposure and the communication and the interaction, as opposed to thinking of ANiC as the national office and the face basically for ANiC? Is it the office? Is it the administration side of things? Would this swing that more towards the dealing directly with the bishops? Because, as mentioned several times today, actually, the whole administration of our churches at every level is not something we want to be the primary focus. And that's why there's only 30 minutes allocated in this few days for this discussion, but it has an impact. And if we downplay the whole administrative thing and make it smaller in that regard, does that make sense? On the other side of the page here, with the disadvantages, ANiC is very new relative to how normal corporations develop. I mean, typically the first 5 years of any company, you're barely getting started. You're lucky if you're making any progress at all in that regard. So are we ready to run with this at this time? I think that's a good thing to be thinking about, and it's a concern that we should all have. And when companies are smaller, the tendency is absolutely not to want to separate after 5 years. It's a scary kind of venture when you're barely off the ground now. We're having difficulty, as referenced, financially. We're trying to balance things, and so what happens with making a change? Is it wise to do that? Are we strong enough yet? The other disadvantage is that we're trying hard to build our foundation, and we've been spending a lot of time on governance. The board is dealing with the various policies and issues, and we want to make sure the foundation is really strong before we make a move to support some other kind of structure. So generally there's a caution and a concern that this may not be in our best interest to be even considering it. It's just way too early to do that. And the concern, as kind of mentioned on this point, the next point is that, we've done incredible in the last 5 years in terms of growth, and a lot of great things are happening. If we decide to split right now, are we going to end up with two very weak dioceses? Where they're both struggling and we're almost starting all over again? Does it really make sense to do it at that time? The other thing is too, there's a lot of people who, they're not interested at all in any of this, and will it just cause some real confusion? Is there one ANiC? Is there two ANiCs? Just the general confusion that takes place with the restructuring. And it's common, even in small companies, as if we're all employees and you're working in a company and the whole reorganization begins to take place, it causes confusion. People are wondering just exactly what does it mean, do we have to operate differently, and so on. So we're concerned with that. One of the thoughts I had as we were just having some discussion on this, though, however, the timing is important, and when is a good time to make a move and when is it not a good time to make a move. You think of people like BlackBerry, who didn't make a move quick enough to adjust to technology and the markets and all those kind of things, and then it's a huge struggle. So I don't think there's any formula that says this is exactly the right time. We have to decide, and we go ahead and we deal with that. One of the biggest issues is this issue of cost. As mentioned, we're struggling right now as a forming organization. We don't have a lot of extra money. And what are the cost implications of suddenly going to two dioceses? Is there two then administrative offices? Would we be coordinating all the administration, but simply having two, basically diocesan kind of offices that would function from one administrative? Those things have to be really dealt with. And the final point on this particular slide is the whole issue of, we don't want, a staff point of view or from any point of view to suddenly get 2 offices and then suddenly we're creating competition. One's bigger than the other. There's this kind of, we don't want, they say competition is healthy, and it is in many areas, but we're not sure it's in the best interest of any of us, sort of at this point. What's going to happen? When it was discussed back in June, it was actually the board turned the issue over. There was no decision, of course, made at the board just to say, yes, we need to get at this. But we had other more pressing business to deal with. But it was turned over to the executive of the ANiC Council to really address it, begin some kind of a process, and come up, I assume, with some kind of recommendations back to the board. Just for various reasons, like we all get into, it slipped to the bottom of the pile, hasn't happened. But I have a feeling it's going to come much higher up the agenda really quickly. And so what we're thinking about today, we simply want you to know that this is on the agenda. There's going to be more discussion about this. Likely, whether it's through the executive or some other ad hoc committee of ANiC, somebody is going to be asked to really study this, to determine the implications of this, and come up with a recommendation, an implementation plan, and some kind of timing on it. And so I would think that when that process kicks in, you're going to be invited to participate in that in some way. But today we wanted to put it on the table, and we also wanted to take the opportunity that if you have some thoughts on it that you could share with us, like right now today, that would help us and guide us as we begin to put together a mandate in terms of reference for a committee that will begin to really dig into this. So what we thought we'd do is just take a few more minutes. I guess I spoke longer than I planned on, so let's forget it. We don't need any input now. So we'll do a few minutes. So we're always interested in input. But anyway, so what we'd like to do is just take a couple of minutes now and then invite any comments or suggestions or even questions regarding this issue to sort of help us and guide us when we bring this back to the board for consideration. Please. No.
I have a comment.
Could you say who you are and where you are?
I'm Mark Larrick-Speth. I'm the convener of the Anglican Sojourner Fellowship. I also, for my sins, spent most of my life in the belly of the beast, aka the public services. And the rule there made me approach this shuddering, because the more layers you put in, those of you who are dealing with LINs and other regional organizations and in the healthcare system will be very familiar with what I'm talking about. You can add to costs very easily, and John, I think you outlined that very well. It seems to me there are 2 questions. The first question is, what is a diocese for? And at the moment, I think the assumption is that this is all about building parishes. And that's a very good assumption. And it goes back to that wonderful challenge that Archbishop Duncan put in front of me. But I think there's a danger of only seeing the ministry as being in a traditional mode, potentially with all the appurtenances of the old style, stable Anglican church. And I wonder whether we're really going to live with that in the future. I've talked about the Anglican Sojourner Fellowship in the past. It's a tiny organization. We've had great support from Bishop Charlie, and we're trying to figure out how to reach Anglican orphans and people who are isolated physically, people who are isolated from the church. More and more, we've decided or come to the conclusion, and we tend to do this very much a step at a time and waiting to see whether it works or not, whether the Holy Spirit's there or saying over here. But we are finding that there is a need to have other kinds of organizations. There is the whole virtual world, the ability to transfer and resource people from resources that are online. I think we've only begun to touch that with some of the organizations like the ANiC website. So I think one of the questions I would want to see answered is, what is the purpose of a division? Is it supervision of parishes? What would you do with other forms of organization that may emerge? The Anglican Sojourners Network is less than 50 people in membership right now, so and many of them are just beginners, so we're not a big player here. But what about vocational ministries? What about outreach ministries? What would happen if you had two dioceses? Would those be shared? Would those be delegated? Would you be duplicating them? What do you really need in the middle? In government, I think the best practice is mostly not followed, where you put the delivery as best you can right down to the bottom, and you have the accountability and the oversight as high up at the top as possible. Canada is not a good example of that as a federation. But how do you do that to keep things simple? How do you do that to provide both pastoral care and encouragement and outreach and building for discipleship? Where do you put those things? Where do you put some of the functions and the specialized services that aren't just building parishes?
Thank you, Mark. Brent.
Brent Stiller, New Psalm Church. Just to piggyback on your comments, this is 2 points. First, it's just a word of encouragement that the working group of the board does ask the question, what is the purpose of a diocese? What are the goals? What are they trying to accomplish? I know there's a vision statement. In terms of vision, values, goals, I want to encourage you in whatever context this discussion is happening to think strategically. You've brought up the issues of finance and limited funding, but in terms of the purpose of the diocese, what is the short, medium, and long-term strategy? What does that look like? And I would encourage you to bring in somebody that has a very sharp and entrepreneurial wit who can help you outside of the confines of your own little bubble, or we all have bubbles, who can really help you to think this through. This is wonderful this conversation's happening, but just get the best. Get the best. Go for the best. Find somebody in the body or outside of the body who's good at that. The second, it does relate to it a little bit, and it has to do more with the third possible diocese on the multicultural thing. This only has me up here once speaking. As I read the book of Acts, I do understand geographical and theological boundaries. This is why we're in ANiC. I do have a great struggle with the fact if we are compartmentalizing dioceses based on the ethnic line, because that is not what we find in the body in Acts things.
Thank you. Yes. Marty?
Yeah, Marty Fraser from The Way, and mine's a quick little point. You have cost, increased cost is a disadvantage, but you're also looking at it only from a high-level point of view. I come from a congregation of 8 people, and for us, it would be decreased cost because it would mean we don't have to send me to Vancouver for meetings, and that really affects small congregations when they're trying to cover costs of travel. So
Thank you.
I'm not that tall. I'm Trudy Hardy from Grace Anglican Church in Clayton, and I agree with a lot of the business points. They're normal business points. I don't think that Jesus gave us churches to run in a normal business function. Not at all. And I look at this like a big tree. Jesus is the CEO. That body is the diocese. Whether it's 1, 2, or 3, they are still one, operating under the same functions. Whether it's east, west, south, north, it doesn't matter. One body, one Jesus. And the roots of that tree are all the people. In this case, in the business model, what I'm seeing, more is better. More from the top is better, because what will happen, the roots will spread out further, and the people that will be affected, if you have more people running the churches, more dioceses, then you can have more churches spreading the gospel, more lay people spreading the gospel, more people working to build up the body of Christ. So mine is to say, don't have a fear of the cost from the top. That's God's department. And I would pray that you pray as well on this and look at the bigger vision, that in this case, more is better. So it will only benefit us all from the end. Thank you.
Thank you.